Every rational question, from the structure of a mathematical proof to the justification of moral principles, depends on logic. It is the underlying principle that allows us to distinguish between sound reasoning from a fallacy. Without it, knowledge disintegrates into opinion and contradiction. Logic is the formal study of knowledge. It provides the structure that ensures conclusions follow from premises with validity. There's main ways that any argument is given is through deduction, or what's called a syllogism. A deductive form of reasoning follows a premise, conclusion mode of argumentation. And so what that would look like is this. So as we can see from the example, if we accept the premises that 1, all men are mortal, and 2, Socrates is a man, then it must therefore conclude that Socrates is immortal. And as we said at the beginning of this video, there's a distinction between validity and soundness. And we would say that such an argument is valid if we know that both premises are true. And we would say that the argument is sound when we know that the premises are true, and it must therefore lead to the conclusion. Now, the thing to make note of here is that such a form of argument takes what appears to be a pattern, and we're going to show what that pattern would look like. Now, as we can see from the given example, we further reduced the argument down, getting closer to what is at the core of what it's trying to tell us. And what we're doing here is that we're symbolizing our argument. And so the way that we do this is that we take one statement, in this case, all men are mortal, will become A. Then we say that if all men are mortal, then we designate Socrates being a man as B. So then we get that if A, all men are mortal, then B, Socrates is immortal. And so we get our conclusion, therefore B, Socrates is immortal. But we can further reduce this down to its logical point. Now, as you can see from the given example, I further reduced it down to its logical point, wherein I've used a symbol of what's called a logical proposition, and it will be designated as our if-then statement. And so the example becomes A, if A, then B, therefore B. But this can still be reduced down to a way where we can logically conclude that indeed B is the answer. Now, as you can see, I've laid this out in what in the field of logic would allow us to give what's called a proof for the conclusion. And so we have our two premises, A, and our second premise, if A, then B. And we would utilize these two premises to help us give proofing for our conclusion. which in this case would be B. Now this symbol, which is not a logical proposition in the field of logic, is used colloquially to allow us to understand what the conclusion is. And so the conclusion in this case would be B. And the way that we would conclude to B is by essentially giving our argument, which would look like this. So as we can see, what I've done here is I've used what's called a valid intermediate reference. And what this allows us to do is to use this to prove that our conclusion is true. How does this work? Well, when we give the premises A, the second premise, if A then B, we utilize this valid intermediate reference, which in this case, this one is called a conjunction elimination. And how this works is that if our first premise is shown, and if we say in this case that if the first premise is there, then that leads to something else, we can use our conjunction elimination to prove that the second thing has to be true. So what we can take away from this is that the philosophy of logic allows us to tap into other avenues of philosophy and schools of thought. And in this case, it would be 1, ethics, 2, metaphysics, and 3, epistemology. And of course, the reason that we can tap into these is because we can utilize in a technical manner the philosophy of logic to thoroughly and without a doubt prove our arguments in a mathematical manner. The point of today's video was just to give basically an introduction into what is logic. And there's much more that could be said on the topic. But the point to take away is that sometimes we just simply say things that come out of our heads without any real substance to back it up. It's the best way, it's the one thing that allows us to validify our arguments, and our reasons for anything should be something that is laid out technically. And in this case, it would be the philosophy of logic.